The year was 1788 when the first ships left English shores carrying their human cargo, men, women, and children sentenced not to death, but to exile. Among them were women whose crimes were often small, stealing bread, a handkerchief, or simply being poor in the wrong place. But their punishment was vast: transportation across the world to a penal colony few had ever heard of, Australia. These ships were prisons that floated on an endless sea. Once the women were herded aboard, the world they knew vanished. The decks above belonged to officers and sailors. Below, the air turned thick with the smell of rot, fear, and sickness. The women were chained together in narrow holds, barely able to sit upright. Their beds were rough boards or damp hammocks, infested with lice. Rats scurried freely. The ocean was their jailer, and time, their punishment. The voyage from Britain to Australia lasted between 4 and 6 months for many. It became a slow descent into despair. Surgeons' journals from ships like the Lady Juliana, the Marianne, and the Friendship describe rows of women lying motionless in sickness, coughing from the damp and the stench. The holds were rarely clean. Buckets overflowed. Fresh water was rationed so tightly that some prisoners licked condensation off the walls just to survive. Meals were a cruel parody of sustenance. Salted meat so tough it had to be chewed for minutes. Moldy biscuits crawling with weevils, and occasionally, thin gruel made of water and oatmeal. Those who couldn't keep food down starved. Those who tried to steal were whipped. But the most unspoken horror was not the hunger or disease. It was what happened when night fell. Guards, sailors, and even surgeons wielded power without oversight. For some, it became a license to abuse. Letters smuggled out from survivors tell of women summoned to the captain's quarters under threat of withheld rations or punishment. Others were traded for privileges, cleaner space, more food, or a place near the upper deck where air was fresh. Consent in that floating world ceased to exist. One surgeon's log, written in careful, detached handwriting, notes the comforts exchanged between the crew and the women as if brutality were merely routine. Another entry describes the birth of a child mid-voyage, a baby conceived in captivity. Born into the belly of a prison ship, the women who resisted faced harsher treatment. Their heads were shaved as punishment. They were bound in irons or confined below deck for days without light. The Mary Ann's records mention one woman tied to the mast for insolence, after she shouted at a guard who tried to touch her. Another, unnamed, was flogged until she lost consciousness for rebellious conduct. Disease soon became their constant companion. Typhus, dysentery, and scurvy swept through the holds like wildfire. Surgeons reported bodies thrown overboard by the dawn, the sea swallowing the nameless dead, before the ship moved on. And yet, despite the horrors, some women found strength where none should have existed. They shared what little they had, a scrap of cloth for warmth, a whispered prayer, or a memory of home. In one journal, a convict named Mary Wade, only 11 years old, was noted for singing lullabies to calm the older women's fears. Decades later, she would become one of Australia's earliest settlers, her descendants numbering in the thousands. There were also women like Charlotte Badger and Mary Bryant, convicts who defied the impossible. Bryant escaped in a small boat with her husband and children, navigating thousands of miles back toward freedom. Charlotte led a mutiny and vanished into the Pacific, never seen again. Their stories became whispered legends among the chained, proof that even the sea could not drown. Defiance, but most never escaped. The voyage ended as cruelly as it began. The ship anchored off Botany Bay, and the women were forced ashore under a blazing sun. Many were half-starved, sunburned, and barefoot. As they stepped onto the unfamiliar soil, their chains were removed, not out of mercy, but because their sentence was only beginning. Australia was not freedom. It was another kind of prison. For the colonial officers waiting on shore, the women were not seen as victims but as labor, bodies to cook, clean, and serve. Some were assigned to settlers, treated as servants or worse. Others were sent to female factories, prisons within prisons where they spun wool, sewed clothes, and were punished for the slightest disobedience. Still, within that brutal world, something unexpected took root: survival. Against all odds, some women adapted. They formed families, ran small businesses, and raised children who would become part of a new nation. Their resilience turned punishment into endurance, exile into legacy. But that truth took centuries to be recognized. For generations, the story of female convicts was buried under shame and silence. Official histories wrote of colonial expansion and civilizing missions, never of the women who built those settlements through suffering. Modern historians and descendants have since uncovered their letters, diaries, and testimonies, fragile traces of humanity carved from pain. These voices tell a story not of criminals, but of survival against a system designed to erase them. Their journey, across oceans and through horror, was one of the darkest chapters in British history, and yet it was also one of rebirth. Because when those ships sailed into the unknown, they carried more than prisoners. They carried the seeds of resilience that would shape a continent. When the last chains were struck off and the sea lay behind them, the women stood on the shores of Australia, not free, but forgotten. Their new lives began under a sun that burned through their skin, in a colony that viewed them as both sinners and tools. In New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land, female factories became the next stage of their punishment. These were grim, fortress-like institutions, part workhouse, part prison. Inside, hundreds of women labored from dawn until dusk, spinning wool, washing clothes, and mending uniforms for the soldiers who guarded them. The air was filled with the sound of creaking looms and coughing, always coughing, from dust and exhaustion. Women were divided into classes: the merit class for those who obeyed, the crime class for those who rebelled. The smallest act, a word out of turn, a tear in a uniform, a moment of defiance, could send a woman from the workroom to solitary confinement. Punishments ranged from hard labor to the stocks. Some were made to wear iron collars engraved with their prisoner numbers, the metal biting their necks under the colonial sun. Food was meager: salted meat, bread, and water. Sleep came in overcrowded cells, where fleas and lice gnawed through the night. Yet worse than hunger was humiliation. Many women were assigned to service in settler households, essentially leased as domestic labor. Some found decent masters, most did not. Abuse was constant. Their bodies were treated as another commodity, another form of servitude. One government report from the 1820s even described these women as a class degraded beyond redemption. Society did not see their survival as strength, only as proof of their corruption. Still, in this harsh world, fragments of humanity refused to die. Some women fell in love, even married. They bore children who would one day be free. Others formed sisterhoods within the factories, quiet alliances of care and resistance. They taught each other to read, wrote songs, and hid notes inside the seams of garments, smuggling messages between prisons. From the Parramatta female factory to the one at Cascades in Tasmania, their names appear in registers, first as convicts, later as midwives, seamstresses, bakers, and settlers. Many lived to see their children thrive in a land that had once been their punishment, but the scars remained. The descendants of these women still carry traces of silence passed down through generations. The unspoken stories of grandmothers and great-grandmothers who arrived in chains. Only in recent decades have historians begun to uncover the truth behind the polite term transportation. The ships were not just vessels of exile. They were instruments of control, floating cages that turned punishment into spectacle and women's suffering into policy. Their voyage represents more than the cruelty of empire. It reveals a pattern repeated through history: how women's bodies, voices, and freedoms were policed under the guise of morality and order. Yet from the darkness rose something extraordinary: endurance. The women who were meant to disappear helped build the very foundations of a new world. They raised generations, created communities, and transformed exile into existence. Their resilience turned shame into legacy and silence into history today. Memorials stand at the sites of the old factories. Their plaques carry words that once would have been unthinkable. They endured, they lived, they built, and as the sea whispers against the Australian coast, one can imagine the ghosts of those ships still lingering, not as cries of pain, but as echoes of defiance. They remind us that behind every record and register lies a human story of women who survived brutality, who carved hope out of horror, and who refused to let the empire define their worth. If you've made it this far, remember them. Share their story, let their names be spoken, and keep the truth of their endurance alive. Because history only forgets when we allow it to.